Hello, everybody. Lovely to see you again today. So, as we've just heard, in this panel, we're going to be looking at the issue of productivity. We saw some slides, which gave us some graphics, but we're going to talk in a little bit more detail about what that means from different perspectives. So let me invite my panel to come and join me, and then I'll be able to introduce you all, and I'll also be able to introduce our speakers. So, Mauri Vagani, please come and, if you'd like to take your place at the lectern, Pierre Bascu, Emily, Dr. David Laborde, and Montse Barovilla. I'll introduce you when it gets to the panel, but let's start by sitting up here. Now, unlike yesterday, we won't be using a microphone in the room for questions, and we do have a Q&A in this panel, so you will need to do it via Slido. You're used to that, you've just done a Slido poll, so keep your mobile phones, your smart devices at the ready. For those of you watching at home, it's the same process. You'll be submitting your questions via Slido. I'll let you know when that is, and you can see on screen now the QR code to use. Right, so Maura, I'm delighted to introduce you. You're the Socioeconomic Analyst for the DG Agriculture and Rural Development of the European Commission, and we're going to explore what it specifically means, the productivity outlook for EU agriculture. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tamsi. And indeed, we are going to talk about productivity and self-sufficiency. But we are also going to talk about some other things, such as production and demand. First of all, let me say that I'm very honored to be here today to present our results, also on behalf of the entire Outlook team, especially also the ones that cannot be here, such as Andrea, that we already mentioned, but also Leon. So let's start with this first slide that was already shown by Bense before about self-sufficiency, but we will look into it in more details. So the EU is self-sufficient in key agricultural commodities, and it is projected to remain so also in the future. This is thanks to the variety of the EU agricultural regions and with the variety in climates that allow to produce a number of different products that satisfy basic and important food security and autonomy needs, of course. As you can see in the graph, the EU is self-sufficient for some of key cereals, such as, for example, wheat and barley. But it is also going to remain self-sufficient for most of the meats and most of the dairy products. Although the EU is expected to remain a net importer of oilseeds, it is also expected to produce more of these in the future, and therefore to reduce the amount of imports of these products, especially thanks also to some of the food policies from the EU that help to produce more of soybeans and also pulses. The EU is also projected to maintain production surpluses in olive oil, in apples, in nectarines and peaches, remaining a net exporter of these products as well. But let's look now into the components of self-sufficiency, meaning production and demand. And we start doing that by looking at the crops. As you can see on the left, yields of arable crops are projected to remain rather stable in the future, remaining resilient to challenges, with some improvements for wheat. There are some factors that will constrain yield growth, as we mentioned before, and these are, for example, more frequent extreme weather events, as well as the more and more area cultivated with lower yielding production practices, and also lower affordability and availability of some inputs, such as, for example, fertilizers for cereals and plant protection products for oilseeds. However, these challenges are also expected to be counterbalanced by positive innovation developments that will boost yields, such as, for example, digitalization technologies, but also innovative active substances for plant protection. There are also ongoing structural changes that are expected to have a positive and favorable impact on yields growth in the future. These are, for example, increasing farm scales, the production moving to more productive areas, and also a closing gap between the yields of Western and Eastern member states. The graph on the right shows the projections for the production of selected fruit and vegetables. As you can see, the production of apples in the EU is expected to grow in the future. This is thanks especially to improvements in yields in some of the most important producing countries, such as Poland and Hungary. The production of tomatoes is expected to remain rather stable by 2035, and this is thanks to the fact that we are producing more and more high-value varieties, which are anyway in high demand, but also that provides lower yields. On the contrary, the production of oranges, peaches, and nectarines might decline in the future following an historical trend, because these crops are challenged by factors such as new pests, increasing labor costs, but also lack of generational renewal with new successors. Looking at demand, the production of agricultural goods of the EU is expected to satisfy mostly domestic food demand. For what concerns arable crops, they can be used for a variety of uses, for food, for feed, for energy, for industrial uses. Among these, of course, feed is the main one and is expected also to remain so in the future, but with a declining trend. This is because of declining production of pig meat and beef, but also because of ongoing efforts in improving feed efficiency, especially for cows and pigs, through, for example, animal genetics, more efficient feeding systems. The use of crops for biofuels is expected to decline, and this is because of strategic policies that will support advanced biofuels and also to limits to the amount of crop-based feedstock that can be used for biofuels. However, part of this feedstock is also expected to be redirected and be used for other industrial uses in the context of the bioeconomy. Moving now to animal products, the EU dairy production is expected to expand, adapting to evolving market conditions. As you can see on the left graph, EU milk production is expected to increase just slightly, despite a declining EU dairy cow herds. The yield of milk is expected to still grow, although at a lower rate than in the past, and this is thanks to better feeding practices, technology, and also animal genetics. Among the different dairy products, especially cheese and whey powder are projected to increase more in production than others. This is because of growing demand, but also because of a focus on high value added products which are in high demand all over the world. On the contrary, the production of products such as whole milk powder is expected to decline because of a decline in demand, but also because of competitive pressure on the international markets. In the graph on the right, you see the EU per capita consumption of selected dairy products. As you can see, the consumption of cheese, butter, and whey powder are expected to increase in the future, while the consumption of fresh dairy product is expected to slightly decline, especially because of a declining demand for drinking milk. But it's important also to note that there are societal changes like more healthy lifestyles and also an aging population that are changing the consumer preferences, especially for fresh dairy products that are fortified with, for example, supplements or more proteins, or on the contrary, have a lower content of fat and sugar. And EU producers are, of course, adapting to these changing consumers' preferences, supplying more of these products. Finally, let's look at the meat sector. Both the overall meat production on the left and the meat consumption on the right are expected to slightly decline, but with important differences between the different types of meat. There's a general shift of consumers' preferences from red to white meat. This is because of better prices, because of more convenient cooking practices, and also because of health concerns, for example. EU beef production is expected to decline by 2035, but the support of the CAP, as well as the expectation for better prices in the future, might slow down this trend. EU pig meat is also expected to decline, especially because of declining demand in some very big countries in international markets, such as, for example, China, but also because of changing consumers' preferences or consumers' perceptions about intensive production systems and environmental regulation. Regarding sheep and goat meat, the production is probably going to decline, but not the consumption, because these are very important products, traditional in many of the European cultures. Finally, about the poultry meat sector and also eggs, the production of this is expected to improve over the time, and this is also not only thanks to an increase in demand, but also the capacity of the EU producers to adapt to more sustainable production systems while still facing persistent challenges such as, for example, the avian influenza. I am stopping here with my presentation. I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you will have the opportunity to download our full report, which will be shown a QR code afterwards. And I left the floor to the panelists. Many thanks.
Thank you so much, Mauro. You've given us a lot to unpack to this panel. And I'm going to introduce my panel, but just to let you know, we are going to make our fantastic team of interpreters work hard because we've got several languages being spoken in the panel. So let me encourage you to get your headphones ready because we're going to be speaking in Spanish and French as well as English. So headphones for those of us here on the panel as well. We've got a little earpiece, so I'll give everyone a second to get themselves organized before we get into the topic, including me, sorting out my little earphone. That's great. Thank you. I notice we're already starting to get some questions in on Slido. That's fantastic. When we get to that bit of the program, we'll be able to take up some of those questions. So let me introduce who we have. I have at the beginning of the panel Pierre Bascoul, the Deputy Director General for DG Agriculture here at the European Commission. I have Emily Bourgoin, who is the Group Director for Public Affairs for RUE, and I'm sure you'll explain to us exactly what that is. I have Montse Barro Villa, who is a fruit and vegetable farmer from Barro Ejias. And I have Dr. David Laborde, Division Director for the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. So we've got a really great range of different perspectives. And just as a reminder, in this panel, we're going to try and understand a little bit more about the elements that Mauro told us about productivity. And he already highlighted both some of the difficult variables like drought or weather, but also the issues around consumer demand, demographic shifts. In Europe, we're an aging continent, what that means to demand, and that also other parts of the world are also getting more productive, and that this has an impact for Europe. So these are some of the topics we're going to talk about. But I'm going to start by looking at the issue of productivity. And Montse, I'm going to come to you first, because the growing productivity is often linked to the fact that we upscale to improve inputs and therefore become more efficient. But can you tell me a little bit from your experience as a fruit and vegetable farmer, what are the key things that make a positive difference in productivity in your farm and in the communities you work with?
Perfecto, muchas gracias primero de todo por invitarme aquí. Es un honor estar hoy aquí representando la figura de los productores. Bien, para mí una mayor escala nos puede llevar a una mayor productividad, pero no siempre tiene que ser así, ni tampoco es el único camino. Para mí hay 3 factores que son claves para aumentar la productividad. El primero sería una agricultura de precisión. Necesitamos basar nuestras decisiones en datos para hacer un mejor uso del agua, datos para hacer un menor consumo de insumos. Al final tenemos que darle al árbol y a la fruta únicamente lo que necesita. El segundo sería utilizar variedades mejoradas y proteger nuestros cultivos. Necesitamos mejorar genéticamente las variedades para que sean más resistentes a las plagas y también proteger nuestros cultivos con sistemas antigranizo o antihelada. Para que os hagáis una idea, actualmente el 30% de la cosecha no llega al mercado. Ni el agricultor recibimos ningún beneficio ni compensación por esta parte. Esto es debido al efecto de las plagas o a los efectos del clima adverso. Pensar que en este caso tenemos que repercutir nuestros costes en el 70% restante de la cosecha, y esto hace que bajemos la competitividad de nuestros precios. Y la tercera parte, que para mí también es clave, sería la cooperación entre agricultores. Podemos conseguir una mayor escala a través de una figura clave para nosotros, como es las organizaciones de productores. Con las organizaciones de productores podemos compartir costes de estructura, podemos compartir formación, podemos hacer programas de innovación mucho más potentes y podemos tener estructuras comerciales mucho más fuertes.
Thank you very much. It was really helpful to understand how the cooperatives and the trade organisations, provide support to the whole sector. So it's not all the work falling on the shoulders of the individual farmer. As a community, you can move forward. As a sector, you can benefit from knowledge from each other. Pierre, let me bring you in now. In the EU policy toolbox, there's many different things, but if I was asking you to think, to pick amongst those tools, the ones that are most aimed at improving productivity, which ones are they?
Thank you very much, Tasmin, for this question. Maybe I would like to start, before answering directly to your question, I would like to start, by emphasizing that increasing productivity and increasing productivity growth is absolutely essential if we are to improve, the competitiveness, the viability and the resilience, of the agricultural sector, but also, of the whole agri-food supply chain. And it is also a way, to keep, the prices, at consumer level, at affordable level. I would like to answer to your question with three elements. The first one is that in order to increase productivity, we need to have a supportive regulatory framework. A regulatory framework, that a supportive framework, that basically encourages innovation, a regulatory framework, that facilitates, access to the farmers, for the farmers, of the latest technological, development. And I would like to use, as an example, the agreement obtained, between the co-legislators concerning the new genomic techniques. This is important development. And for productivity in agriculture, this could be really a game changer, because this could facilitate the authorization and the use of plant varieties which are more resistant to pests, more resistant to drought, to extreme climatic events. So this is very important. I could also mention the fact that the Commission is also currently reviewing part of the regulatory framework governing, the protection of plants. So this could also contribute positively to productivity growth. I would like also to mention the second element is the financial tools and the financial incentives. Yesterday we heard that we shouldn't talk too much about subsidy, but financial incentives, so be it. And I will not repeat what my colleague Diego Cangafano mentioned regarding, the European Competitiveness Fund, the framework program for research and innovation. There is a very significant boost there with budget available up to 40 billion euro. in order to fill, I think, the gap, in agri-food investment, in order to foster, research in sustainable practices. So this is very important. But I would like to underline, coming from DG Agri, I would like to underline the key role played, I think, by the CAP, and in particular the toolbox. I think the very, solid and robust and, I would say, performant toolbox that we have with many, I would say, wide-ranging, policy instruments that support productivity growth. I can talk about, investment support, innovation support, support for biosecurity, support also for risk management, because I think when farmers decide, I think, for instance, to change practices, to change production system, I think they need also to be able to manage well, I think, the risk that they may take. And I think the last element that I would like to mention, and I think it was referred to by Mauro, it concerns, I think, the digital tools, and I think the need that we will have, I think, to facilitate, I think, access to these digital tools in the future. This is absolutely key. I think this is what is happening in our life and in all economic sectors. But in agriculture, this can be also a real game changer, having access to artificial intelligence, sensors, Internet of Things, etc. But I think for that, I would like to underline, I think, two key conditions in order to really optimize the use of digital tools. It is first, I think, to improve, I think, what I would call the digital infrastructure, so internet connection, etc., in rural areas, and also we need to improve, I think, the skills, the digital skills, I think, of the farming community. It has already started, and it is quite impressive, but we need to upscale, I think, what we are doing. And with these three elements, regulatory framework, financial incentive, and digital tools, I think we can be confident in the capacity of European agriculture, but also the European food supply chain to really increase productivity growth, to be competitive, and to generate income.
Thank you. I think perhaps it would be quite helpful for us to explore a little bit what we mean by the concept of productivity, because we're going for it. Everyone says, let's be more productive, but maybe let's just explore a little bit amongst ourselves what that actually means. And David, I'm going to invite you to come in. Obviously, Food and Agriculture Organization has a global perspective, but on this issue of productivity, it's not a simple concept. There are many different layers, many different ways of looking at it. So you could look at it just by yields, the amount of stuff you actually produce. You could also argue that a sustainable productivity approach doesn't just look at that, it looks at the way it's produced, it looks at the impact of that, it looks at the sort of longer term aspects. So when you think about the concept of sustainable production, help us to sort of unpick what are the main elements in that, and how does the EU perform compared to other competitors in the future?
Bonjour à tous, merci. Donc effectivement, ce concept de productivité est essentiel. D'une manière simple, c'est comment on peut produire plus avec moins. Ce qui est quand même l'un des défis majeurs dans les 25 années qui se présentent à nous, vu qu'on vit sur une planète avec des ressources limitées et une population et un revenu qui va continuer de croître. Alors, traditionnellement, dans l'agriculture, y compris dans les années 70, quand on parlait de productivité, on s'intéressait au rendement. Donc combien de tonnes on produit par hectare, mais c'est une vision extrêmement limitée de la productivité, puisque c'est la productivité de la terre. Si vous augmentez les rendements en mettant plus de machines, plus de travailleurs, plus de fertilisants, vous augmentez les rendements, mais vous n'augmentez pas forcément l'efficacité du système. Donc les économistes ont un concept un peu plus sophistiqué, qui est la productivité totale des facteurs, qui essaye de capturer cela et de voir comment le système est plus efficace. Et quand on accroît cette productivité, normalement aussi, on accroît la profitabilité et, in fine, potentiellement, la compétitivité des acteurs. Mais c'est un concept qui ne capture que finalement que ce qui a un prix, fondamentalement. Or, aujourd'hui, on sait que la santé des sols, l'eau, la biodiversité est finalement aussi un facteur de production du monde agricole. Et parfois, on le consomme, on le brûle, mais on ne le mesure pas. Et donc, on peut avoir une illusion de gain de productivité. Et ce qu'on veut, c'est améliorer ça. Et à la FAO, cette question de comment on mesure les choses, comment aussi on peut être sûr que les différents pays vont se mettre d'accord sur un même standard, parce que c'est important de parler la même langue, d'utiliser les mêmes chiffres, c'est l'une de nos missions. Parce que quand on parle de productivité durable, ce n'est pas simplement avec une finalité environnementale. La durabilité, c'est économique, c'est social, c'est environnemental, et bien mesurer la productivité, c'est finalement se répondre à une question qui, je pense, concerne beaucoup de gens dans la salle, c'est combien il y aura d'agriculteurs en 2050 ? Est-ce qu'on aura toujours des sols, de l'eau pour fournir ça ? Donc ce travail de mesure, vous voyez, c'est non seulement une question technique, pour mes collègues statisticiens, guides, comme on parlait, mais aussi essentiel pour guider les politiques. Parce que si votre métrique de succès, c'est simplement les rendements, et donc quand vous améliorez la consommation en eau, comme le font nos collègues du secteur horticulteur, eh bien, ça n'apparaît pas. On n'incite pas ni les acteurs ni les politiques à faire les bonnes actions, parce qu'à la fin, les gens veulent dire « est-ce que j'ai amélioré mon indicateur ?» Et donc un mauvais indicateur, ça peut amener des mauvaises politiques. Et c'est ce qu'on essaye de régler. Alors, ce que je veux rajouter, c'est peut-être deux choses. La première, c'est aussi, je pense que comme on a une approche systémique de nos jours, on doit aussi penser à la productivité comme une mesure globale d'efficacité du système. Il y a des choses qu'on fait sur les fermes, mais la manière dont on va transformer le lait en yaourt avec des enzymes plus efficaces, c'est aussi un gain de productivité. La manière dont on réduit les pertes post-récolte, c'est un gain de productivité, que bien sûr on ne peut pas demander au secteur primaire d'être responsable, mais aussi en matière de concept, finalement, c'est comment on livre plus au consommateur final, tout en utilisant moins de ressources et à un coût économique accru. Alors, pour atteindre les objectifs mondiaux, à la FAO, on fait aussi des projections, on a construit une feuille de route globale, et la productivité mondiale doit augmenter. Elle doit augmenter bien plus vite qu'elle a augmenté dans les 20 dernières années, tout en prenant en compte les facteurs climatiques. Les pays à haut revenu, comme l'Europe, doivent continuer de progresser, mais encore plus, on doit voir les pays à faible revenu et à revenu intermédiaire rattraper le retard de productivité, parce que c'est là aussi où il va y avoir une forte demande. Maintenant, par rapport à votre dernière question sur comment l'Europe se porte, l'Europe a un grand nombre d'atouts, je veux dire technologiques, financiers. Au niveau de la réglementation, il y a sûrement des choses à optimiser, parce que la vitesse d'innovation est importante. Quelles sont aussi les solutions technologiques qu'on offre aux agriculteurs? Et est-ce qu'encore une fois, on a des politiques qui vont se cibler sur les résultats ou plutôt sur les pratiques? C'est vraiment un enjeu essentiel, parce que ce sont les acteurs de terrain qui savent comment améliorer la productivité. Maintenant, si on a, en regardant les projections qu'on a vues, l'Europe semble un peu en retard, en tout cas, ou va perdre certains avantages en matière de productivité, ce qui va avoir des impacts en matière de compétitivité aussi. Et donc, améliorer la productivité en Europe, c'est bon pour le monde, parce que ça veut dire que le système est plus efficace, ça veut dire qu'on fait des gains en matière de ressources naturelles aussi, mais ça sera important pour les acteurs économiques européens.
Thank you. So some very positive words, but again, you've made the point that productivity around the world has to improve. And other parts of the world have got sort of much further to go to increase their productivity, but Europe needs to keep working on it because we still have some way to go. You also encourage us to make sure we're measuring the right things. Because if your success factors, if you're measuring the wrong things, just say inputs and outputs, without taking into account a number of other things like the health of the soil, the air and the water, we just use without actually factoring in, we aren't looking at the efficiency of the whole system. So you've invited us to think about a whole systems approach. So these are some interesting ideas that I'm sure we'll pick up on when we have the Q&A with the audience. Pierre, let me bring you back in, because we've had some perspectives there from David looking at a global point of view. Let's focus now on EU agriculture, and we've heard some of the challenges, but let's see what you think are the challenges and opportunities for European agriculture, looking at this issue now that we've broadened it out, not just production, but sustainable productivity growth.
Thank you. There's a lot of challenges, but also I think a lot of opportunities for EU agriculture. In terms of challenges, I would I would tend, I think, to group them in three blocks. I think there's a first group of challenges which are more related to, and this is what David mentioned, to the impact of climate change and the emergence of exceptional climatic conditions. There are also challenges related to the degradation of natural resources, and this is something absolutely fundamental. If we are to ensure food security in the EU, we need to take care about our natural resources, and primarily of soil. And there are, in this first group, I think there are elements related also to plant health, animal disease. We see now the re-emergence of animal disease and the pressure, so we need to address that, and this is why it is important, but the farming sector, but also with the public policy, that I think we continue investing in climate resilient farming practices, into the transition to sustainable production systems, and also to improve, I think, the biosecurity in order to address, I think, this pest and this animal disease pressure. Second group of challenges, in my view, are more related to economic elements, and this is, I think, the volatility. Ben presented that. I think, increased volatility, low profitability level, I think, in the EU, and also an element that Ben mentioned relates to the high level of input cost, in particular related to energy and to fertilizers. And I think for this, we need to, I would say, strengthen and diversify, I think, the sources of inputs by stimulating domestic production in the EU, but also by strengthening and diversifying our import sources. We need also to improve, I think, the efficiency in the public support, I think, for income, for investment support, risk management. We need also to make, I think, the food supply chain, I would say, work better and fairer, in order to also, redistribute to some extent the value added generated by the chain to the benefit, I think, of farmers. We need also to increase and support, I think, the development of the bioeconomy. This was mentioned yesterday by Commissioner Hansen. We adopted recently a strategy on this bioeconomy. I think this is a very promising, element and development, and also for the farming sector, but for the rest of the chain. And the third group of challenges, I would say, specific to the EU is, well, specific, I don't know exactly, but I think this is also the aging of the farming population. We talked about that yesterday. Clearly, people who have gray hair like me, are a bit maybe less prone, I think, to changes and to move it into, innovative, practices, rather than, I think, the young ones. So we need to promote, I think, this generation renewal. And one element which is also specific to agriculture is the fragmentation of the sector, with a lot of small and medium-sized farms, and sometimes this does slow, I think, the diffusion, I think, of skills and of knowledge, and this may limit to some extent, I think, the productivity growth. I realize I forgot to talk about, I think, the opportunities, and I think there's a lot. I think, as David mentioned, I think there is the consumer demand and societal demand, I think, for sustainably produced food. This is absolutely fundamental. We have also the technology in the EU, and we are, highly developed, I would say, region. There is also, supportive public policy. We shouldn't forget, in the EU, we have the CEP, research and innovation, competitiveness support, etc. So I think the public framework and the policy framework is very, very supportive. Third element is that, in terms of opportunity, is the bioeconomy. I was just mentioning that is really a way to optimize, I think, the use, I think, of agricultural product, but also co-product, byproduct, waste, etc. There's a lot of economic, and income, streams that we can develop. And maybe, I think, the last element that I wanted to mention in terms of opportunity is also, I think, the farming community. The farming community has shown, I think, a fantastic and amazing capacity to adapt to new production conditions, to new demand, I think, from society and from our consumers. And I believe, I think, this is this capacity to adapt, and I think this commitment and this skill, I think, of our farming community that can, present, I think, very positive perspective in terms of growth in productivity level in the EU, because clearly, not only in the EU, but at world level, we are more and more people with the same level of resources. So I think we need to do, as David said, more. We need to produce more with less and better.
Thank you. I wonder if you could help us to just understand the potential contradictions between, you've just mentioned that actually part of the productivity gaps are around fragmentation. So in order to get economies of scale, you need to scale up. And yet, we talked yesterday about young farmers and generational renewal, and they need access to land, and that's probably going to be family farms and smaller farms. So when we look at it from the point of view, it's like we need to increase productivity. But on the other hand, we've got to encourage new farmers to come in, and we've got to make small farms still viable, particularly for farmers at the beginning of their life in order to get the credit that they need and to sort of build up their business. I wonder how we manage those contradictions, because on the one hand, and I'm coming back to what David said, it really matters what you measure, what your success criteria are. So we want to support young farmers, people starting out, experimenting with smaller farms. But on the other hand, we know that to get productivity gains, we need economies of scale, we need to do it at much sort of broader level. That to me seems like there's a bit of a tension. How do we manage that tension?
Yeah, which is a very good point. I think it is possible, because clearly I think not all the productivity gains need to come from increasing the size of the operations. A lot of productivity gains I think can be made by basically developing and, for instance, developing the processing of product and generating value added, at farm level. We can also promote, the innovative practices and the development of production system by making farmers working together in a cooperative way. We can also support, the transfer, of knowledge and innovation between all farmers. So it's not, I would say, it's not primarily an issue of scale. It's more a thing of working together in an integrated way, in a cooperative way, and facilitating basically the diffusion, of this knowledge, to all farmers. And then actually, you make me think about one point that I forgot to mention. We have this European Innovation Partnership. It's a specific instrument in the CEP, but it's a very fundamental one because it enables to better connect, the scientists, the advisors, and the farmers. And the advisory services are absolutely crucial to develop, productivity. So scale is an issue, but I think it's not, in my view, the fundamental issue in order to promote, productivity in the EU. And basically, for the last 50 years, farmers in the EU have shown that you can be productive, you can be efficient, you can be, profitable, while having, a limited size.
Thank you. And I know that echoes what Montse said earlier about the importance of the trade associations, the local cooperatives, and the sort of sectoral organizations that provide that knowledge transfer, that support, and able to find where there's opportunities to make systems more efficient. Let's now move on to the next issue, which is the issue of demand and production, because Mauro in his first presentation said, look, there's changing consumer demands. People are eating more chicken and less beef. There's, as people get older, they need to make sure they're keeping their protein up. So, Emily, I'm going to bring you in because, and you can tell us a little bit about RUA, but we know that the EU is projected to remain highly self-sufficient in the main agricultural and food commodities. That's great news, but it's also a big challenge to maintain that as demand is changing, because what we produce has to meet different flavors, different tastes, different expectations from consumers. Now, you work closely with farmers to try and bring it closer to consumers. How easy or difficult will it be for your group to link supply to future consumer demands and expectations? I mean, first of all, how do you predict what consumers, they're a fickle lot, what they're going to want, especially when we've got lots of YouTube influencers telling people what they should and shouldn't eat. So how do you help make that link and balance what farmers need to produce with what consumers expect?
Merci. En effet, pour nous, je crois que le défi n'est pas tellement sur la productivité ou sur la quantité. En fait, c'est vrai que c'est sur le sujet de la qualité et de la diversité, parce qu'on a des attentes de consommateurs qui sont de plus en plus élevées sur le climat, sur la biodiversité, sur le bien-être animal. Et ça augmente évidemment les coûts de production et les standards. Donc en fait, il va falloir qu'on relie ça en tant que retailer, en tant que distributeur. Et on s'est posé beaucoup de questions parce que pour nous, c'est un grand défi sur avoir des coûts de production pour les producteurs et puis avoir des prix favorables aussi aux consommateurs. Je crois que notre réponse à nous, pour le groupe Rewe, c'est qu'on est un modèle coopératif. Donc ça nous aide puisqu'on a des relations directes avec 33 000 producteurs et petites entreprises. Donc on a une très bonne connaissance du marché. Ça nous permet aussi de voir, en fait, de réagir aux attentes des consommateurs directement en l'intégrant dans la consommation. Donc on s'est dit, voilà, puisqu'on a une bonne connaissance de ce marché ou de la chaîne d'approvisionnement, il faut qu'on commence par le côté technique, et le côté technique, c'est le contrat. C'est-à-dire comment assurer, en fait, cette viabilité pour les agriculteurs, puisque nous, on veut s'assurer des produits qui répondent aux exigences, en fait, des consommateurs. Donc on s'est inspiré de la France sur, par exemple, des contrats à long terme ou des contrats tripartites pour donner un petit peu plus de sécurité, de planification aux agriculteurs. Et c'est une meilleure répartition des risques aussi, ce genre de contrat. C'est-à-dire que le risque n'est pas sur la production, seulement le risque, en fait, est tout au long de la chaîne. Et ça nous a permis, en fait, en développant ce genre de contrat, de pouvoir donner l'opportunité d'investir sur des mesures plus durables pour les agriculteurs et en même temps de pouvoir fournir une différenciation sur les produits dans nos magasins. Mais ça, c'est le côté agriculteur, on va dire technique sur les contrats, mais en même temps, on doit réagir aussi à des mouvements globaux. Par exemple, on a le cacao et le café, on voit que ce sont des marchés très volatiles, ce sont des segments où on a très très peu de main dessus. Et donc là aussi, on essaie de réagir sur ce contexte global. Donc on a créé par exemple Choviva, c'est une alternative au cacao avec des produits qui ne proviennent que d'Europe. Donc on essaie de donner aussi des opportunités à des nouvelles filières pour ouvrir d'autres segments, parce qu'en effet, on voit que la diversité pour le consommateur, en fait, est très importante. Donc c'est un défi, parfois c'est schizophrène, en effet, pour un distributeur de proposer tout, mais on essaie de régler ça sur des structures techniques, comme je dis, de contrats et de donner des assurances, et sur le côté on a un assortiment global pour le consommateur, parce que les attentes sont très, très diverses, et de plus en plus.
Thank you. So as a cooperative, you have a foot in both camps, if you like. You're working closely with consumers, but you also directly have a relationship with many different producers. And it's interesting, you mentioned that coffee is very volatile. And I don't know if I'm sure you've all read the news articles about, will there be coffee in the future? We've got a major problem of, the big world producers have got droughts and massive drop in yields. And so interesting to hear we might have a future made in Europe for alternative to cocoa, to cacao. So watch out for that one. Very interesting, because we're here in Belgium, the home of chocolate, and many other European countries would claim to have that as well. Monse, let me bring you in as a farmer. We've heard about the experiences from a retailer, but your experience on the ground in Spain, what future adjustments do you need to make about the way that you grow, what crops you choose, etc., to respond to changing consumer demand? And we heard that from Mauro in the beginning, and also from Pierre, our needs for biomass and the bioeconomy. So as a farmer, you've got to choose what you plant based on what you think consumers want, but also there are other financial opportunities through the bioeconomy, etc. Tell us a little bit about how you would plan for that and what adjustments you make.
Para nosotros, yo veo que no hay una agricultura sostenible en el tiempo si no somos capaces de leer lo que el consumidor realmente demanda. Por eso es tan importante las relaciones con las cadenas de supermercado. Tienen que ser relaciones muy directas y con proyecciones muy a largo término. Demasiadas veces nos encontramos aún que el agricultor es el eslabón más débil de la cadena y es la víctima de guerras de precio, especialmente entre los discounters en muchos países de Europa. Estas situaciones se tienen que terminar y tenemos que ver cómo entre la cadena de supermercados y los agricultores somos capaces de trabajar juntos, trabajar a largo plazo y hacer productos más innovadores, productos que al final el consumidor de una fruta, que es lo que es nuestra especialidad en nuestra casa, sea buena de comer, que el consumidor disfrute, que el consumidor repita, que promovamos el consumo de estos productos. También con programas como, por ejemplo, desde la Unión Europea, con la fruta en las escuelas, tenemos que incentivar al consumidor del futuro. Yo creo que estamos en un entorno que es ideal, ya que los consumidores valoran la salud y la fruta está directamente relacionado con la salud, pero tenemos que tener la capacidad de explotarlo, ¿no? Y por lo tanto, para mí, en este caso, es está plenamente ligado al trabajo que tenemos que hacer conjuntamente y a largo plazo el agricultor y la cadena de distribución. Y en cuanto a las alternativas, como por ejemplo puede ser el mercado de la biomasa, la realidad es que para nosotros en este momento en la fruticultura tiene un impacto muy pequeño porque solo utilizamos los restos de poda y en este momento es mejor dejarlos en el campo y así mejorar el suelo y hacer que tengamos que utilizar menos fertilizantes que no explorar el mercado de la biomasa que tiene un retorno aún demasiado pequeño para nosotros.
Thank you for that. So that was interesting to hear that in the area of biomass, because fruit and vegetables, as you say, it's largely consumed. So there's very little potential that's left. And also, I'd love to hear from you the sustainability aspect to say, well, it's better that that carbon stays on the farm, on the field, because it nourishes the next crop that we're going to put forward. So the sort of limitations of the biomass, but opportunities for the bioeconomy. Okay, we're now going to move to our next block of conversation, which is looking about affordability, cost of living, and how that affects consumer choices. And just to signal to you all that after I've asked this next set of questions, I'm going to be opening the floor to you, and you will be setting the content. So can we put a reminder? Yes, you should have your slido.com up on screen with the QR code. That's the place to send your questions. Okay, David, I'm going to come to you about this issue. We saw in the very first presentation of the morning, the sort of one of those very jagged slides which showed food prices, and we all know what that's like, you know, being to the supermarket and suddenly the money on our purse buys a lot less than it used to. And that, of course, is going to affect how people eat. In the future, how might the impact of future food security and healthy eating patterns, how would that affect our sort of demand and supply?
Donc, déjà, je pense qu'au niveau mondial, il faut garder à l'esprit qu'on a 2,6 milliards de personnes qui ne peuvent pas se permettre d'acheter un régime alimentaire sain. En Europe, bien sûr, ces chiffres sont beaucoup plus bas. Souvent, les gens n'adoptent pas un régime alimentaire sain, pas pour des raisons purement économiques, mais pour des questions d'options qui leur sont ouvertes ou de style de vie ou d'influence, comme vous faisiez référence. Mais je pense qu'il ne faut pas oublier aussi qu'en Europe, on a entre 7 et 8% de la population qui est en insécurité alimentaire. Donc si vous les rassemblez ensemble, c'est plus de 30 millions de personnes. C'est la population du 5e État membre de l'Union, la Pologne. Donc je pense qu'il ne faut pas aussi oublier qu'on a aussi un problème de sécurité alimentaire pour une partie de la population. Et pour ces gens-là, le coût de l'alimentation est un vrai problème. Alors, on l'a vu dans les années récentes aussi, la période d'inflation qu'on a connue, d'inflation générale, mais aussi d'inflation alimentaire, c'est quelque chose que le monde n'avait pas connu depuis les années 70. Et c'est en partie causé par une multiplication de chocs. Choc climatique, choc géopolitique. Et ces chocs ne vont pas disparaître. D'où l'importance aussi de créer plus de résilience dans le système. Alors, en même temps, on a vu qu'un certain nombre de choix qu'on doit faire peut augmenter les coûts de production et peuvent augmenter les prix. Et là, on revient encore sur les débats sur la productivité. Parce que la seule manière à la fois de maintenir des prix raisonnable pour les consommateurs et un niveau de revenu acceptable pour les agriculteurs en particulier, c'est bien des gains de productivité. Si on ne les fait pas, in fine, on va augmenter les prix pour les consommateurs. Et quand on augmente les prix pour les consommateurs, ce sont les consommateurs les plus vulnérables, les plus pauvres, qui se retrouvent exclus de la consommation. Et comme je l'ai dit précédemment, quand on parle de durabilité, c'est environnemental, c'est social, c'est économique. On ne peut pas atteindre l'un au sacrifice de l'autre. Sinon, on a des problèmes politiques. Donc, comme il a été dit par les autres panélistes, on est aussi dans un marché où on voit de plus en plus de niches, de diversité auxquelles il faut répondre. Et c'est là où certains outils de politique ne sont pas forcément les plus adaptés. Parce que changer tout le marché ou avoir des incitations pour tous les producteurs, ce n'est pas cohérent avec l'idée qu'il va falloir plus de spécialisation. Mais on a ces tendances de fond, tout en sachant aussi que le fait que notre population ne consomme pas des régimes alimentaires sains a un coût économique. Donc, il y a un coût immédiat à améliorer la qualité des régimes alimentaires, mais il y a un coût de moyen et long terme à ne le pas faire. Et là, encore une fois, on peut parler de productivité. Parce que des régimes alimentaires qui ne sont pas sains, c'est une productivité des hommes et des femmes qui fournissent leur énergie à l'économie plus faible. Donc c'est moins de croissance. Et vraiment, ce que l'on mange a un impact sur nos finances publiques, sur la productivité privée, et c'est pour ça que ça doit être quelque chose de prioritaire. Maintenant, je dirais, ce qu'on a vu aussi dans les années récentes, c'est que même les consommateurs qui ont des revenus les plus élevés, quand les prix alimentaires augmentent, ils font des choix, ils vont réduire la qualité ou la qualité perçue de ce qu'ils consomment. Par exemple, on a vu comment la croissance du secteur biologique a été arrêtée quand on a eu la crise économique, et quand les prix ont augmenté, eh bien, le part des marchés sont arrêtés ou ont baissé. Et donc là aussi, quand on a une politique de l'offre qui va être de dire on veut augmenter la part d'agriculture biologique, est-ce qu'il y a vraiment une demande pour ça? Et quelles sont les conditions socio-économiques qui créent cette demande-là?
Thank you. I mean, first of all, it's great that we're talking about food in this panel, because one of the things that I noticed yesterday in some of the questions that were coming in via Slido is that people saying, yeah, agriculture, but food, it's connected, and that's absolutely the heart of what we're talking about at this panel. And also, you know, it's also important to recognise that a population is diverse, and there are more and more specific needs within that, and that's a requirement of a much broader range of products. And that gives me a great opportunity to bring Emily in, because you have several classes of products to satisfy these different levels of consumers. Some, of course, are going to be very price sensitive, and others may be driven by other considerations that they would have. But how do you see these segments evolving over time? And you were nodding when David was talking about, you know, during the economic crisis, the organic food sector shrank, and other sectors grew, and that, you know, there are many drivers that happen. And as a retailer, you've got to try and predict these things and make sure you've got the right ranges for the right people.
C'est vrai que pour nous, ce qui est très difficile, c'est qu'on doit équilibrer des intérêts qui sont parfois divergents. Donc on doit avoir des intérêts rémunérateurs pour les agriculteurs et des prix favorables aux consommateurs. En même temps, répondre aux attentes qui font des coûts plus élevés pour les standards à cause du bien-être durable, des exigences et des attentes aussi des consommateurs. Donc on doit en effet relier tout ça. Et le prix reste central. C'est vrai que je ne peux que confirmer, on est encore dans une période d'inflation, et le prix, en fait, en Allemagne, en tout cas, surtout que c'est un pays très très sensible sur le prix, ce sont les 4 premiers critères de choix d'un magasin, c'est le prix. Donc on est obligé de faire avec. Donc c'est pour ça que nos marques, par exemple d'entrée de gamme, sont très importantes, parce que ça permet encore cet accès à tous, pour les consommateurs, à tous les produits. Donc ça c'est très important, puisque ça joue un rôle clé aussi dans la nutrition et dans l'alimentation de nos clients. Mais ça ne reste pas que le seul élément. C'est-à-dire qu'en fait, on a là aussi du côté du consommateur, il n'y a pas un consommateur. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a beaucoup de consommateurs qui cherchent du sens aussi dans les achats. Et ça, c'est très intéressant à voir, parce qu'en effet, il y a un petit peu ce côté schizophrène chez le consommateur, c'est que même les personnes qui peuvent se le permettre, qui peuvent acheter plus cher, vont de temps en temps faire attention au prix, mais de l'autre côté, donc, chercher chez nous des produits à valeur ajoutée, et donc forcément plus cher. Donc nous, on doit proposer toute cette gamme de produits. Et ce qui est intéressant, c'est qu'on voit... Il y a eu un problème, enfin, il y a eu en effet une baisse dans la consommation de bio, mais qui revient. Donc on voit que les sujets, par exemple, comme la régionalité, tout ce qui est origine, tout ce qui est développement durable avec le bien-être animal en premier focus, en fait, reprennent un petit peu de l'intérêt. Et nous, on se demande, mais comment on peut faire ça pour offrir aux consommateurs en fait, ces produits, pour leur montrer. Donc je pense qu'on a un gros rôle dans la communication vis-à-vis du consommateur et on doit pouvoir mettre ces produits très en avance dans les magasins. Donc on fait des campagnes qui mettent en avance les produits à valeur ajoutée, on fait des publicités sur ce genre de produits, on met tout ce qui est le local et le régional à faire des campagnes d'image sur les producteurs pour que les clients en fait, comprennent tout ce qu'il y a par derrière. Donc ça nous permet un petit peu, c'est un levier qu'on a dans nos magasins. Et puis, ce qu'il ne faut pas oublier, c'est qu'il y a des changements structurels. Par exemple, il y a moins de consommation de viande. Il y a plus de flexitariens. Donc, en fait, c'est tout un nouveau groupe, on va dire, de consommateurs qui est pour l'instant déjà un très, très gros segment, mais qui augmente en plus. Donc, on se dit comment réagir à cette baisse de consommation de viande et en même temps à ces attentes. Donc, on a développé une stratégie de protéines pour dire on propose de la viande avec du bien-être animal et en même temps, on développe les protéines végétales et des innovations avec tout ce qui est food tech. Donc, on est toujours en train de balancer et de gérer en fait ces intérêts parfois divergents, en effet, sur ces segments-là. Mais c'est aussi très, très intéressant parce que ça nous permet de réagir, il y a beaucoup de tendances et il faut qu'on voit à la fin, comme je disais, c'est gérer tous ces segments. Il n'y a pas le consommateur, ça coexiste. Et en fait, je pense que c'est le message, c'est de dire ça coexiste entre le prix, mais aussi la durabilité. Et tout ça, évidemment, sous couvert d'avoir des offres rémunératrices pour les agriculteurs. Donc on est toujours un petit peu dans ce triangle et on essaye, voilà, comme on peut, de répondre aux tendances. Et d'anticiper, si possible, c'est toujours mieux.
Excellent. Thank you very much. It's at this point I'm going to be turning to the questions that the EU have submitted, and we've had quite a few that have come in. But I think this first one I'm going to ask you about, which is not quite yet on there, but it was asking about Ukraine. Ukraine came up yesterday, and it's going to come up again today. We've got a public offer of membership. And I had a lovely farmer from Poland on my panel yesterday who was talking about, the impact of the conflict in Ukraine on farm prices, etc. How would, and in the projections that we were making on the EU Agri Outlook, did we take into account Ukraine's membership and its potential contribution to EU productivity? It's a sort of very fertile country. It's the black earth of Ukraine that produces a lot. But of course, it's also a low-cost country with low labour costs, and that has an impact. It's a bit of a political hot potato, but I'm going to throw that to you, Pierre. Would you like to reflect on the potential impact of Ukraine joining the EU on the Common Agriculture Policy and our overall import-export position?
Okay, thank you very much, Tasmin. I think we are far beyond, the issue of productivity and productivity growth. No, clearly, I think, and let's be honest, I think the history of the EU, is only history of enlargement. And we need to see, the discussion about enlargement to Ukraine, into the broader geopolitical framework. It's not a question specific to agriculture, but clearly, this is something on which we are working. There's a lot of opportunities, and Ukrainian agriculture is very, as you said, productive. It has, fantastic soil and with very, very high, yield capacity. It is also complementing quite well, the EU agriculture. It's a major supplier of protein, at world level. It contributes, to the food security, in the world. So this is something very, very important. But clearly, due to its high level of competitiveness and high level of productivity, there are also some risks, some challenges in terms of pressure on the internal market and pressure, into some specific sectors, in particular, the rubber crop sector, the poultry sector and the sugar sector. So this is element that that we need to see how, we can, optimize, the opportunities and minimize, the potential impact that, a Ukraine membership could have, in the longer term. But at the same time, it's a question of balance between these opportunities in the food on the food side, because as Emily said, having Ukraine is around 50, 55, or 45 million new consumers in the EU of dairy product, of meat, etc. So we need to balance that. With the potential disruption that we could see. For some specific sectors which are more vulnerable in the EU. And this will be, I think, our work in the future if Ukraine is to enter into the EU to facilitate, I think, this transition and this gradual, integration of Ukraine in our market. I think we have already started to prepare. I think with the, DCFTA, I think this agreement, I think the deep and comprehensive, agreement that we have that manages, I think, the trade, I think, with Ukraine. We adjusted it and reviewed, I think, this agreement. But I think this is a long-term issue that I think that we are starting already to prepare. But for us, what is important is to look at this not only from the agricultural side. Clearly, agriculture is very important there, and we need to address, I think, the potential disruption. But we need also to look at this, and I would say primarily at the geopolitical, dimension. And this is, I think, enlarging to Ukraine. I think could have, could be, I think, a major, geopolitical step, I think, for the EU. But clearly, this is something that we have under our radar screen, not only as in terms of trade relation, as I said before, but also in terms of future membership. But I think once again, I think, and I will stop with that. The EU is used, I think, to deal, I think, with enlargement. We have seen it, in 80, 81, 86. 95, 2004, 2009, 2013. So this is normal, I would say normal business, I think, for EU institution. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a question, I think, that might be interesting. I'm going to ask David and Montse to respond to, because somebody says, do you believe that using suitable digital and data technologies in agriculture has the potential to address productivity challenges? So maybe from Montse, you can tell us a little bit, the kinds of digital data tools that are used in fruit and vegetable growing. And then David, to sort of bigger perspective, we've heard actually all morning that, this is an area of potential growth, is using new tech tools. But Montse, can you tell us, what does that mean? Do you have examples of that? I met that lovely man from Finland this morning, and he told me about drones in agriculture. Where's there opportunity for digital and technical tools to improve productivity?
Yo creo que claramente hay una oportunidad. Primero, para atraer a todo este talento de nuevas generaciones, tenemos un problema de relevo en el campo, y la manera que tenemos que atraer a esta gente joven es hacer el sector más atractivo. Y haciendo el sector más atractivo es haciendo todo este paso hacia adelante, hacia la digitalización, robotización. También es verdad que para aumentar la productividad será clave. El coste más grande que tenemos en la agricultura ahora mismo es la mano de obra. Aparte de la falta de mano de obra que tenemos, que muchas veces tenemos que traerla de fuera de Europa, con todo un proceso que estamos iniciando de robotización en el campo, vamos a llegar a reducir este coste de mano de obra y a cambiarlo ya por mano de obra menos cualificada para manos de obra más cualificada, más tecnificada y que aporte más valor, y que nos permita también ajustar más los precios que llegan al consumidor final. Y por lo tanto, para mí es clave, y aquí también será clave lo que comentaba yo anteriormente de las organizaciones de productores. Es decir, no nos podemos imaginar que un agricultor solo de una edad de 55, 65 años, que puede estar la media, haga este paso hacia adelante, hacia la digitalización. Tiene que tener toda una red de apoyo, que toda esta red de apoyo se la pueden dar las organizaciones de productores con sus programas operativos, que le van a permitir hacer todas estas inversiones en digitalización, en robotización, y que van a ser claves para la productividad en los próximos años.
Non, je pense que définitivement, cette question d'utiliser les nouvelles technologies et les technologies numériques pour accélérer la productivité ont des gains évidents. On a vu comment optimiser, par exemple, l'utilisation d'intrants, savoir sur quelle partie exacte d'un champ on veut appliquer un traitement. Ça a des gains économiques, ça a des gains environnementaux. Vous parliez précédemment, effectivement, pendant longtemps, on était dans un schéma où pour augmenter la productivité, il fallait faire des économies d'échelle. Donc, une plus grande ferme se traduisait toujours par des coûts économiques plus bas. Avec les drones, ce n'est plus le cas. La mécanisation peut prendre une autre forme. De même, comment on fournit du soutien aux agriculteurs, de l'information, etc. Avec l'ère numérique, les coûts unitaires baissent sans pour autant les internaliser dans une ferme. Donc on a toutes ces options. Maintenant, l'ère numérique de l'agriculture, ce n'est pas la panacée, la solution ultime. Pour atteindre les gains de productivité dont on parle, c'est vraiment une complémentarité de différentes solutions. Ce n'est pas une solution toute seule qui va nous faire 20% dans les 10 années qui viennent. Mais c'est cette multiplication de différentes interventions, de différentes innovations qui vont permettre, année après année, d'atteindre les objectifs et de le faire aussi d'une manière diverse. Parce que même, effectivement, utiliser plus de technologies numériques dans l'agriculture, ça peut être aussi exposer le secteur agricole à des cyberattaques, etc., qui vont demander d'autres investissements. Donc oui, on a ce potentiel qui bénéficie à l'ensemble de l'économie et dans le secteur agricole, c'est clair. Mais aussi l'ère numérique, par exemple, est en train d'accélérer l'innovation en matière de développement de nouvelles variétés. Et on avait une question sur les variétés et les semences, c'est essentiel. Mais aussi toute la partie innovation scientifique bénéficie de cela. Et puis, suivre effectivement les besoins du consommateur au jour le jour, optimiser l'offre dans un supermarché, réduire les stocks pour réduire le gaspillage. C'est aussi une autre utilisation des techniques numériques et qui reprend cette idée que les gains de productivité, il faut les voir à l'échelle systémique et cette question de connectivité peuvent y contribuer.
Emily, maybe I could bring you in on this because David's just mentioned that, the digital and data tools can also be further along the value chain to improve productivity. And we know that about a third of losses, and wastage, particularly in fruit and vegetables, happens, in the retail and then even in the consumers' fridges. So are there any tools that you are looking at that could help us improve our productivity from the retail sector?
Oui, tout à fait. On utilise aussi beaucoup les nouvelles technologies et puis même KI pour optimiser toutes nos chaînes d'approvisionnement. Sur la logistique, par exemple, sur les chaînes de froid, sur la gestion des stocks. Donc maintenant, c'est vrai que sur le food waste, en fait, on a à peu près seulement 1%. Et qu'on essaye toujours de voir. On a pas mal de dons aussi qu'on fait en Allemagne en fait, avec les banques alimentaires. Donc c'est vrai qu'on a optimisé beaucoup toute la chaîne de production. Il y a très peu d'optimisation qui est encore possible à faire, finalement, c'est vrai. Donc on essaie de voir sur des trajets plus courts aussi, de voir sur les stocks en général dans nos entrepôts. Et puis on a aussi un problème de personnel. On a du mal aussi à trouver des personnes. Il faut qu'on trouve du personnel pour nos magasins. On a des ouvertures qui sont très larges. Donc là, c'est pareil. Il faut tout optimiser pour pouvoir optimiser la présence des personnes sur place et pour qu'elles aient un rôle de conseil, puisqu'on veut aller dans ce côté nutritionnel. On veut montrer les produits à valeur ajoutée. Et donc, c'est le transfert qu'on a auprès du consommateur. Donc tout ça, ça nous aide un petit peu à nous concentrer sur, on va dire, sur les rôles, sur notre rôle d'avenir qu'on aimerait avoir. Et on utilise ça exactement beaucoup. On optimise aussi nos assortiments, nos emplacements aussi dans les rayons avec KI, avec IA. En allemand, avec l'IA pour essayer de voir est-ce qu'il y a un potentiel, par exemple, si le consommateur ou si les clients d'un supermarché, d'un de nos adhérents, on voit qu'il y a une forte clientèle végétarienne, par exemple, ou flexitarien. Est-ce que ça ne vaudrait pas plus le coup de réduire tel rayon et d'augmenter tel rayon pour proposer des produits nouveaux? Et donc, comme ça, on génère toute une valeur ajoutée pour le consommateur, pour les fournisseurs et puis aussi pour nos adhérents.
Excellent, thank you. Well, just to give everyone a time check, we've got about 3 minutes left in this panel, and I'm going to ask Pierre to comment on we've had a couple of questions that are all linked, which is about the soy, our dependence on soy, or, looking at, our need to import animal feed. So it's saying, what does productivity look like in livestock and animal feed if we reduce our dependency on soy or imported oil grains? So it says, clearly meat and dairy production is highly dependent on soy inputs. What if you took those out of the calculation? What if we were more self-sufficient in that? So perhaps you could close our panel with some comments on that.
Okay, thank you very much. Clearly, I think, as I mentioned in my first intervention, the enhancing, I think, the productivity level of soil is absolutely fundamental. We have seen that, I think, over the last decades. I think the quality of our soil is degrading. Not everywhere, but I think in some specific regions. So we really need to address that, because we shouldn't forget we have an obligation in the treaty, and we have a moral obligation is to supply food to our citizens, and I would say beyond. And if we are to do that, I think we need to preserve our production capacity, our production factors, and soil, I think, is the factor, the fundamental factor of production in agriculture, and this is why we need to look at this. We need to improve, I think, the impact of our production system and production practices on the soil and the EU. On your second point related to dairy and livestock sector and the import of feed, clearly we are a small continent in terms of territory, of course, and not for everything. And clearly, I think we are dependent on some imports of feed, for instance, I think also of fertilizers, so on some key products that are used, I think, in the agricultural sector, in the food supply chain. And I do not think that we will manage to be self-sufficient for all the different products if we continue to consume the same, if we continue to have the same food diet as we have it now in the EU. What matters is not too much that I think we are net import of feed, net import of some feed product, and net import of fertilizer. What matters is that I think we need to secure and to diversify our import sources. We have seen it, I think, the turbulent, I would say, geopolitical situation. We see that, alliances are changing. We see that, I think, the behavior, I think, of some countries, big exporting countries, is becoming more difficult to predict, and I'm being polite. So what matters is to diversify, strengthen, and secure our import sources, and not only our, export destination. And this is one of the issues that I think we are trying to do in terms of trade policy, is not only exporting, but also securing our production base, because having sufficient amount of fertilizer, sufficient amount of feed is important, I think, for our livestock production and dairy production.
Excellent. We've come to the end of our time together, and I want to say a warm thank you to our panel, to Pierre, to Emily, to Montse, and David. Could we say thank you? Would you like to do please go and take a seat, and let me hand over to Sasha.
Thank you so much, Tamsin. Thank you. Really, really interesting, and what a great place to start, to actually looking at productivity and the different things that can feed into that area that we've decided to start with. Thank you very much for all your questions, and it's very clear reading through the questions. There are so many different thoughts and different aspects and the nuance to this as we go through. So we're now going to take the next 3 sessions as we go through the rest of the day, the different areas. So please do continue to give your questions as we go through those different areas that we've picked as being the ones to focus on. What we're going to do now is take a break, get yourselves a cup of coffee. When you go outside, you'll actually find more people to speak to, because we have for you 3 different areas, just to really get in touch with all the facts and the figures that Benza was talking about. So the Outlook report team are here. There's many of your colleagues here to have a chat with, to go through the different areas in a bit more detail. So they have a stand outside. Plus the JRC also here to talk to you, so they can talk more about the modelling behind this report. And they've been mentioned before, the Farm Sustainability Data Network, the FADN, the FSDN, however you are still referring to them. They are also here so they can talk about the new way that they are looking at different data, because if we don't have the right data, we can't look to the future. So delegates will be back in the room in half an hour. If you're joining us online, half an hour from now, a little under half an hour. So take a break, and we will see you back when we start talking about global markets and competition. Thank you very much. Thank you.